So I come to Canada as a settler, and I feel privileged every day to continuously be learning more about this land. As many of you know, the name of the avenue on which our faculty sits, Spadina, comes from the Anishinaabe Ishpadina, meaning a place on the hill. This site was also part of an important trail for several First Nations. As an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we note this history, and we wish to honor these connections as we move forward collectively. So tonight, we're here to welcome Chelina Odbert of Kounkuey Design Initiative as this year's Michael Hough OALA Visiting Critic in Landscape Architecture. I have the double honor of welcoming all of you as the director of our MLA program, but I'm also the Daniels Faculty Appointed Educator on the OALA Council. So this lecture is made possible with the generous support of the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects. In 2003, the association established this endowment at the faculty to enrich the academic experience of students in our Masters of Landscape Architecture and other programs. The annual award honors Michael Hough and his approach to landscape architecture and planning, which was grounded in urban ecology and aimed to connect the city with nature, both integrally and visibly. The OALA's continued support enables our students to benefit from the insights and creativity of outstanding visiting professors, practitioners, and critics operating in the field of landscape architecture. So I'd like to thank all of the OALA members in the audience tonight. Most specifically, we have Doris Chi here as past president, representing the OALA, along with many other members. And then I would like to offer our sincerest welcome to Bridget Hough for being here with us tonight. With your support, we're able to have Chelina Odbert join us. Yesterday, she engaged directly with our MLA students, and tonight we'll hear her speak on the subject of design and the just public realm. And her talk will be followed by a question and answer period. So in Chelina's words, often the public realm is defined as publicly owned places and spaces that belong to everyone. But reality finds that these ostensibly inclusive environments tend to be accessible only to a privileged few. So tonight, Chelina will share some of her strategies for making the public realm more public, demonstrating ways that designers, planners, and communities can ensure that these shared spaces are as inclusive and accessible as their name suggests. Chelina is the co-founder and CEO of Kounkuey Design Initiative, which works around the world across disciplines of urban planning, policy, research, architecture, community organizing, civil engineering, landscape, all to bring good design to places where it often isn't found, and for connecting localized design initiatives to large-scale policy change. Her work is driven by the belief in the power of community-engaged design to advance racial and economic equity, in addition to environmental resilience in neighborhoods and cities. She connects landscape-rich design interventions to large-scale planning efforts, and she models an equity-driven and impactful path forward for the next generation of designers. So given our faculty's interdisciplinary interests and the amazing work done within our master's programs to explore issues at the intersection of climate resilience and social justice, it seems only appropriate for this year's Hough OALA lecture to come from an interdisciplinary practitioner committed to building a more just public realm, one that's complete, inclusive, and resilient. So let's all welcome Chelina Odbert.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Elise, Robert, and colleagues for the invitation, and thank you, Ali, for all of your help coordinating. It's really an honor to be this year's Michael Hough OALA Visiting Critic, and it's been a pleasure to be a part of your community this week. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with all of you yesterday in the MLA program. So tonight I'd like to answer 5 questions that you may not even know that you had. Who is KDI? Is public space really public? What's so unjust about the public realm? And why does any of this matter? And finally, what can designers do about it? I hope this will set us up for a robust discussion and Q&A at the end of the talk. Okay, so let's jump in with question number 1. Who are we? Well, in simplest terms, KDI is a nonprofit design and community development firm focused on working with communities to build a more just public realm. And let's define that term, public realm. We understand the public realm to be the public places and spaces where we access opportunity. Our streets, our parks, cultural institutions, transit networks, to name just a few. At KDI, we're an interdisciplinary team that combines the best of engineering, landscape architecture, community organizing, architecture, and urban planning to positively shape the built environment. And what unites us is the intention with which we practice. As you can see from these answers from our team, most people don't end up at KDI by accident. On the contrary, this interdisciplinary, mission-driven collective is foundational and intentional to who we are. It's foundational because KDI started as an independent, interdisciplinary student project in an environment much like this at the GSD in 2006. A group of classmates with architecture, landscape, and urban planning backgrounds, all working intentionally to ask the question how we could use our design training to address big issues like urban poverty and environmental degradation. There were just 2 problems. Our design education wasn't quite preparing us to work in this way. And then the further along we got in our design studies, the better we understood our own profession's responsibility in creating the very injustices and traumas that we hope to practice to undo. So it was these 2 things that moved us to try to create a different mode of practice. We didn't exactly know what that meant when we first set out for Kenya, where our co-founder Arthur Adea is from. The only thing we did know before arriving here in this informal settlement in Nairobi called Kibera is that we knew very little. And so any value that we could add would have to come by first listening to and being led by those that called the place home. This was something that another co-founder, Koch, who is Thai, described as Kounkuey, the process of getting to know intimately. And it was with this first public space project that we learned the importance of and eventually made a commitment as a firm to create what we call a just public realm. We'll get much more into that in a minute, but today we work from 4 offices on 3 continents, and we do projects in about a dozen other places in between. But building a just public realm, unfortunately, can't be done through design and construction alone. So we work across 4 primary service areas to get the job done. We do design and build those social amenities that are missing, but we also do the long-range planning needed to ensure that the future of a community is inclusive and equitable. Other times, we have to first change policy that's standing in the way of building equity in the public realm. And still at other times, we have to zoom back out even further and first collect the data and conduct the research that helps tell a more full story of a problem. Because with that data set, you can drive the resources that are needed to fully address a challenge. So whatever the project type is, we do it through a shared and iterative design and decision-making process with community members at the center. And this process is one that, of course, begins with a project, but lasts through all phases. This participation is one of 3 core principles that guides us. The other 2 are networking and integration. And networking is this simple idea that one project, no matter how wonderful it is never enough to address a problem at scale. And so we commit to a community or a region over the long term to network interventions and shift those outcomes at scale. And then integration is just the understanding that the challenges of justice in the public realm are intersectional, meaning that they aren't just design challenges. And so the solutions have to be intersectional too. And so to the extent possible, we include layers of social and economic change elements in our work as well. We'll spend much of our time tonight looking at projects that illustrate exactly how we do that, but first I'd like to spend some time zooming out to this concept itself, a just public realm. What exactly is it? Why does it matter? Well, to answer these questions, we need look no further than the two adjectives in the phrase, just and public. Let's start with the easier one. In planning and design, there may be no phrase more ubiquitous than public space. And if I asked you to define it, you might come up with something like this: a place that's open and accessible to everyone, plain and simple. But despite this common understanding of the public realm as the places in our communities that are open and accessible to everyone, regardless of category or creed, we know that in reality, the public realm is free, accessible, and unbiased for a very narrow few. And more often, for women, people of color, the LGBTQIA community, and others, the public realm is instead intimidating, exclusionary, inaccessible, and contested. So let's look at a few examples, many taken from this great book, through what can be called the taxonomy of exclusion to understand just what this looks like. The taxonomy helps us understand in a series of everyday public realm situations who is being excluded. This is just a partial list of those that are most frequently left out. It also helps us understand who is doing the exclusion. Again, just a partial list. It helps us understand why, what's driving those actions, intentionally or unintentionally, and what tactic is being employed to do that excluding. Sometimes physical, sometimes political. The first example is perhaps a familiar one. Benches and how they are designed make it the case that benches oftentimes, in fact, aren't truly public. So who do they exclude? Well, it depends on the design and depends on the location, of course, but often they exclude the unhoused, they exclude caregivers, and here's some of the who, how, and why. Fortunately, designers have crafted a fitting response to this, but that isn't always the case. Here's another example, pathways. Pathways are often unintentionally exclusive by the simple fact of the material that's chosen. Then there are the less obvious examples. So what could be so unpublic about making a reservation to use the grass in a park? Well, I think if you take a moment to think about it, you can see that the sheer act of reserving public space leaves the poor, leaves youth, leaves the unhoused out. And then, of course, there are the social pressures that masquerade as rules to make the public realm less public, like the no loitering signs on public benches, which really does beg the question, if that bench is not a place to loiter, then what exactly is its function? Many of us have heard the story of Chris Cooper, a birder unwelcome in New York Central Park just because of perceptions of race. And then there's this last example, perhaps the most intentional of all, these fake garage doors, a manipulation of design and regulation done with the sole purpose of keeping a public space, in this case a beach, private, by ensuring that no one could park near the tiny, almost hidden entrance because of the curb cuts granted as a result of the false garage doors. So our work on one level is simply to put the public back in public space, to make sure that parks, streets, transit networks are as welcoming and functional for women, people of color, folks with different housing and income statuses as they are for white, able-bodied, cisgendered men. But working to make something truly public is only possible if it exists in the first place. This rests on the assumption that there's a thriving public realm that exists in every community, and we just need to make sure that everyone feels welcome in it. Unfortunately, it is probably no surprise that this is not the case, and that's where the just part comes in. To us, just means inclusive, as we've just discussed, but it also means complete, having all of the necessary parts, and resilient, able to withstand shock without permanent rupture. And meeting this definition matters because we know empirically that the #1 predictor of life expectancy is zip code. If you live on the Upper East Side of New York, you're likely to enjoy 90 years of life. If you live a few blocks over in East Harlem, you'll have just 71. And what the data makes plain is that this almost 19-year discrepancy isn't a matter of genetics or even access to health care. It's a matter of access to, yes, a just public realm. Specifically, you live 19 years longer on the Upper East Side because you have access to 3 things. The first is social infrastructure. Investment in social infrastructure like schools, public space, community centers, and cultural institutions, which then creates access to income. It's also access to safety, including safe streets, safe and affordable housing stock, and transportation networks that people feel safe to use. And then there's access to a healthy environment. For example, the ability to live away from environmental hazards like landfills, and reliable basic infrastructure like water and sanitation, the ability to withstand climate disasters. And what we also know is that it doesn't seem to matter where you are on the planet, the division between those communities that have this access and those that don't is drawn along lines of race, ethnicity, and income. Those with more money and social privilege have access to a more just public realm. And those who do not live every day with the consequences of those injustices. We understood this implicitly the moment that we arrived in Nairobi as students and stood here at the wall between the Royal Nairobi Golf Course and Kibera. As we expanded our model to the US, it was clear that despite vastly different urban and not so urban conditions on 2 different sides of the world, this pattern of proximity of disparity repeats. The distance is most often mere miles or even meters, and these disparities aren't just unfortunate or unfair, as we have seen here, they are literally life-altering. And so this is where we get back to that question of why we practice. Quite simply, we practice at KDI because the list of things that help someone live better and longer isn't actually a list of things for healthcare professionals to provide alone. It's instead a list of things that those of us in this room can, should, and are on the front lines of shaping. So for the rest of our time together, I'd like to introduce you to 3 communities where we're working with residents to build a more just public realm. And then I'll share a series of projects that illustrate how we work to increase access across these 3 categories that we've just covered. As you'll see, one size does not fit all. From vacant lots and parking lots to creek beds and refugee camps, KDI's work lives in the realm of the overlooked, forgotten or underutilized spaces in a community that have vast potential for meeting residents' priority needs. Our design method changes on a context basis. At one moment, redesigning street vending carts to enable an easier pathway for economic development. In another, organizing resident collectives to advocate for shade equity in their communities. In all three places where we work, Nairobi, the Coachella Valley, and Los Angeles, the physical context could not be more different. But the problem as it relates to access is very much the same. There's a distinct lack of it in low-income communities of colors of these regions, underscored by decades of willful government disinvestment. So let's go first to Kibera. That's where we started as a firm, considered the largest urban informal settlement in Africa. Over 300 people live in a space the size of New York City's Central Park, 300,000 people, with access that is difficult, water that is highly polluted and controlled by cartels, sanitation that is informal and unreliable, food security that is precarious, open space that is non-existent, and housing that is temporary. These issues compound to result in a community suffering from massive environmental injustices such as extreme flooding and polluted waterways, limited access to basic sanitation and waste infrastructure, and an urgent need for public spaces that support economic development. In the eastern Coachella Valley of California, rural farm worker communities exist next door to wealthy resort towns like Palm Springs and venues like the Coachella Music Festival. Tens of thousands of people, 40% who live under the poverty line, do not have access to adequate transportation. Their drinking water contains arsenic levels above the federal legal limits. Sanitation is largely unpermitted and dependent on aging septic systems. Insecure access to food is common despite being a major agricultural producer for the country. And open space is an afterthought despite the abundance of vacant land. Housing stock is reliant upon unpermitted mobile home parks. And this lack of infrastructural access is further exacerbated by temperatures that routinely reach over 110 degrees in the summer, combined with some of the highest rates of asthma in the state from poor air quality. These issues of sanitation, lack of public space, and inadequate potable water mirror in many ways those seen in Kibera on the other side of the world. And then lastly, there's the place that I call home, Los Angeles, the second largest city by population in the country. We face massive disparities in mobility access, water sources that are quickly depleting, sanitation systems that privilege some populations over others, a growing number of food insecure households, communities of color that have 64% less access to parks than white neighborhoods, and a housing crisis that has resulted in over 60,000 people experiencing homelessness. So even though Los Angeles is more dense than the Coachella Valley and more formally developed than Kibera, the stories they tell are similar: unsafe streets, lack of shade equity, an unequal distribution of resources, and high-quality open spaces affect low-income communities more heavily than privileged high-income areas. But that isn't the whole story in any of these places. Another shining thing that they have in common is the strength of their communities, finding opportunity and forging improvements with every available tool. Entrepreneurship is part of the culture, like the over 12,000 street food vendors in Los Angeles. There's vibrant expressions of art and culture often found in public spaces, like the folklorico groups of the eastern Coachella Valley. And collective action is used to advocate for their communities despite being up against huge hurdles, like in Kibera, where 1 in every 2 residents is an active member of a community group. We believe that design and community action are the keys to beginning to unlock these systems of inequity. And how we do that, especially against seemingly impossible problems, is perhaps best seen through these 3 lenses of access to social infrastructure, safety, and healthy environments. So let's take a look at some projects in each of these categories. Of all the 3 categories we'll look at in the public realm, social infrastructure is perhaps the most obvious and straightforward one for a design firm to address. When things like cultural institutions, parks, and schools are missing from a community, a design firm, once invited, can design and build them. And in all 3 places, Nairobi, Coachella, Los Angeles, the problem as it relates to social infrastructure is the same. There's a distinct lack of it in the low-income communities of color in these places. So first, we'll focus on this topic through a project that we call Adopt a Lot. In neighborhoods like South and East Los Angeles, the disparities caused by the lack of social infrastructure are particularly evident. There are more than 2,000 city-owned vacant lots in Los Angeles, and they are concentrated in the low-income communities of color that also lack access to parks and open spaces. Because the region is so densely developed and is in the midst of a housing crisis, publicly owned land for parks is scarce. Additionally, a typical park project in Los Angeles takes millions of dollars and many years to plan and build. What we know is that these communities can't afford to wait generations for new parks to be developed. So we began to look for ways to quickly fill the gaps, using underutilized spaces like these vacant lots and transforming them into these flexible assets while more permanent resources are on the way. So the unmaintained vacant lots, like this one, often become targets for illegal dumping, crime, and nuisance, with conditions that then lead to overall degradation in the neighborhood. They put a financial strain on the city, and they reduce quality of life. So in 2013, KDI joined a group of 5 other organizations to address community health and equitable land use. We started with a simple mission of working with residents to gain access to vacant lots and transform them into neighborhood resources. Our goal was to first do this through short-term activations as a pathway to a more long-term transformation. And over those next several years, we partnered with residents to do transformations like this one. And our idea was that we would demonstrate first to elected officials the potential for vacant lots to address what residents knew could be done with them and address things that were missing in the neighborhoods. And what we thought was that this would be the way to affect the policy change that was standing in the way of gaining access to these lots. It worked, and we went on to develop a program after passing a motion through the city council. And then together with the city of Los Angeles, we launched a pilot through which community groups could adopt city-owned vacant lots for up to 2 years while working with us and other coalition members to make the space into a permanent public space. To make these activations possible, we designed and fabricated for lots like these a kit of parts, which we call the plane. This is a set of furnishing pieces that can be assembled in different ways quite easily to facilitate a variety of uses on a site. This kit kickstarts the transformation process for resident groups that may not have a design or construction background or capacity, and they go through a participatory design process that allows them to envision how they might use that plane to reimagine the lot. That participatory design process includes budgeting, voting, and design activities that ultimately help folks decide what's most important to them. Here's a couple of sites. This one is in the community of El Sereno in East Los Angeles. This lot was adopted by a group called the El Sereno Community Land Trust. This group focused on adding planters to beautify the space and also areas for meeting and other community gatherings to happen. This resulted in a vibrant lot thanks to the efforts of residents. And here's another example in the South LA community of Watts. This lot was adopted by a local bike club, the East Side Riders. They wanted to reimagine the lot and public space to include a bike skills course with bike mounds and ramps, a picnic area, native landscaping, and a community mural. They just celebrated the opening of their lot back in August of last year. In Nairobi, building social infrastructure looks similar. The idea of creating a network of public spaces from waste spaces, as we did in the Adopt a Lot project, came from our first and longest running project in Kibera called the Kibera Public Space Project. It's a collection of public spaces along the heavily contaminated Gong River, spaces like this that have been reclaimed to create a network of diverse amenities across multiple sites that work together as a spine of infrastructure that cuts through the settlement. Each project includes some income-generating activities, strategies for repairing the riparian zone, including flood control strategies. We've reclaimed these waste spaces really out of necessity, because when we first came to Kibera, what we heard and saw first and foremost was that there was no vacant land to develop the needed amenities that residents were prioritizing. And so we saw an opportunity in these riverine waste spaces to reclaim them and transform them from sites of crime and dumping and other nuisances to spaces that could really meet needs of the priority needs of residents. So currently we have 12 sites in this network, and those sites are each managed by a particular community group that then builds social capital and power to work on other change initiatives where they live. After 5 years of building these productive public spaces, as we call them, in Kenya, we then began exploring the potential to apply the same model in the eastern Coachella Valley. The result there is a growing network of community parks and programs that also combine economic development opportunities with leisure and recreation spaces and important components of stormwater management and environmental risk mitigation. The first project was here in the community of North Shore, a 5-acre park. It was completed in 2018. And then the community of Oasis, just about a 10-minute drive away, opened the first phase of their 14-acre site in 2021. We recently then helped a third community, another 10 minutes away, acquire funding for a third 10-acre park there. But our work on social infrastructure isn't only at the local scale. When possible, we look to connect our on-the-ground learning to larger scale advocacy and education efforts that help disseminate the knowledge and experience to other places facing similar challenges. So the last project I want to show in this category is an example of that from Argentina. Through a partnership with the World Bank and the Argentine Ministry, we were asked to work in an informal settlement in Mendoza, Argentina, to develop a model for how across the country this ministry might do upgrading in informal settlements, upgrading of social infrastructure through a gender-inclusive lens. So essentially, how do you design streets and parks and bus stops to work as well for women and other genders as they do for men? So this, what started as a very localized project, we designed a process by which this, we could ensure a gender-inclusive outcome. We then designed a series of potential park options out of that process. The communities selected one. That park was recently just completed and has made a radical transformation in the community. But from that work, that was done in partnership with the World Bank, the bank asked us to think about how we might write a larger manual that could be a handbook on gender-inclusive planning and design that could be useful at a global scale. So we tried to do that. It's not an easy task. Turns out the world is not all the same. But we did our best, and this handbook gives direct, practical guidance to World Bank staff and project leaders on how to make sure that social infrastructure is both present in informal settlements, but also welcoming and inclusive to all that will use it. This process of creating small-scale proofs of concept and leveraging them to affect policy change has really been a hallmark of our work through many of our different projects across different sectors, including safety. And gender equitable design has much to do with this category of safety, whether it's on the streets of Los Angeles, Kibera, or Coachella, and really most anywhere in between. People in these communities, often women, do not feel safe where they live. They don't feel safe on the streets, moving around in transit, in public spaces, and more. So I want to focus on first on a project called Kibera Green Streets, and then I'll show a few others. But these all show how our approach to safety applies, again, across the very different geographies where we work. So at its heart, Kibera Green Streets is a KDI solution to a government project that was very much out of scale and out of touch with the community. So we redesigned both the process and the outcome to layer much-needed road and drainage infrastructure with economic development and recreation opportunities. So first, to go back a step, in 2013, as part of that Kibera public space project that I just mentioned, we began working at a site along the river in Kibera. This was our 5th public space in Kibera. This site was already serving as a vital connector within the settlement, and then we added a bridge that spanned the river to help folks leave the settlement to the formal part of the city. But before we did that, there was a previous bridge that posed significant health risks because of how it was designed, the lack of maintenance, and all of this was particularly true in the rainy season. So we designed a new bridge that you can see in the corner here, along with a new site that has sanitation centers, showers and toilets, a community washing facility, a community hall, a couple of small vending kiosks, and of course the bridge. That was complete in 2019, and we were able to have the bridge adopted by the county. But then in 2021, the Kenyan government began a process of major road upgrades all throughout the settlement. And when city workers first came to the pathway that led down to this site in order to build a new road, they came equipped only with a 1 to 10,000 scale map. Knowing that community members had been advocating for significant improvements in water, drainage, power, sanitation, we saw this as an opportunity to bring local government and community together to build multi-beneficial infrastructure that would actually work instead of settling for a road that would be too steep and too dangerous to use. So As in all of our projects, we began through a community co-design process where residents were put directly in the design seat. For this project, we partnered with 3 local groups to guide that process. We began with a transect walk, working with community members to highlight the safety concerns that were limiting access for women and children particularly, as well as those with disabilities. And from there, we had multiple visioning and co-design workshops, and these were used to determine the design elements and programs, but also to build small business plans and long-term maintenance programs for how these spaces would work over the long term. So through many iterations of design testing, ramping strategies at the site, which is almost 12 feet wide and an almost 60% slope, we created a design that accommodates a new play space, a pedestrian walkway that provides shade, economic opportunities and safe passageways, and importantly, a new drainage channel designed to accommodate a 100-year flood. So the project was constructed over the course of 7 months, and during that time, youth were trained as part of the construction team. And the resulting impact is a pedestrian-friendly space that allows for social gatherings, economic opportunities, and a huge increase in perceived and real physical safety. It now also serves as a really strong example to the Kenyon Road Authority that first arrived on the site with that out-of-scale map, and other government actors on how to integrate inclusive public spaces while planning for better basic infrastructure like roads. And then just a couple of other examples that show how that can kind of shift scales. In the eastern Coachella Valley, we developed 3 neighborhood mobility plans that prioritize pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure in an area with almost no sidewalks and no street lighting. And then by getting these plans adopted in partnership with the county, we were able to help them find the implementation funds to put this infrastructure in place. While doing that work, we learned from residents the need for addressing the heat impacts, in particular at bus stops where no shade is provided and the wait between buses can often exceed an hour. So working with that very same leadership team that started with us first designing a park in Oasis and then designing the mobility plans in Oasis, we then worked to do a shade equity analysis and build prototype shade structures like the one that you see here. And then in Los Angeles, our team is also working on gender equity and mobility with the Department of Transportation, first doing a study to understand where transportation was failing women and other genders. And that has then led to, the results of that study have led us to a gender equity action plan that will be released in a month or so that really looks at the department as a whole across the 50 or so different things that the department does to ask the question, where are the levers of change to ensure that this transit network ultimately works equally well for all genders? And so that leads us to the last category. This is the healthy environment and how we work to do just that. So in the richest country in the world, to contemplate that we still do not have universal access to clean water, let alone clean air, is sometimes hard to make sense of. But what we see in this category is that across geographies where water and environmental issues are high, many times, even when these conditions are being addressed, they are being seen and evaluated through the lens of the the ecology or the habitats in these places as opposed to through the human impacts at the environment, or in addition to the human impacts that are also being had as a result. Consistently, we see a lack of the residents' lived experience brought into the planning and decision-making processes, and it's this exclusion that then leads to an underflow of resources and thought leadership in how to address them. So I want to look at one project, our Salton Sea Environmental Justice Campaign. In California, the Salton Sea is our largest lake. It's shrinking rapidly and releasing polluted lake bed dust into the air. This is a really complex issue, and as a result, we're working on it through multiple strategies. We're building local leadership capacity to advocate in environmental justice forums. We're also working toward policy change by building new data sets through citizen science, like the photo that you saw when we were entering the auditorium tonight. And we're transforming the landscape itself around the sea by working with state parks to turn the state park shore into pieces of multi-beneficial social infrastructure. The surrounding community's relationship with the sea is one of love and hate. The historical agricultural runoff has caused a major environmental hazard over decades for tens of thousands of residents that live along the lake, leading to these high rates of asthma, unexplainable nosebleeds, and really nauseating smells when there are large fish die-offs. So we're working with local college students to build this intergenerational power, developing their leadership skills through organizing trainings and some of the data collection that I mentioned. And then as part of a larger NGO coalition, we're working with academic institutions to include residents in monitoring water quality and map the receding shoreline. Then to advance policy change, we are doing things like developing easy to access and culturally relevant tools that help people within the community and outside of it understand the full scope of the challenges of the sea. Something like this is a loteria deck. It's essentially a bingo game where the cards are tied to the different elements and challenges of the sea. And a product like this is really useful to shift the narrative of who is being impacted by the conditions of the sea, and in turn shift the allocation of resources that are meant to address these challenges. And to do this environmental justice in a place that is as spread out as the Eastern Coachella Valley, we have to go where the people are. So with that youth collective that I just mentioned, we designed this mobile advocacy hub that's used to bring programs to the different shoreline communities. Environmental justice, like many of the issues I've talked about tonight, is intersectional. So it's important in our work at the sea that we try to address other issues affecting the community at the same time. And so we've done that by looking at the shoreline as a place of social transformation, a place of economic development, as well as a site of ecological reclamation. In Los Angeles and Kibera, we find similar social conditions that are acting as barriers between communities and a healthy environment. So just two projects to close with. One here is in Los Angeles, in a Latinx community of Puente Hills. There sits the nation's largest trash heap, the Puente Hills landfill. It held 1/3 of Los Angeles County's garbage until it was closed for good in 2013. And it's now set to become the first regional park that the county has created in 30 years. Carving from 142 acres from a 1,400-acre landfill. We're part of a much larger team led by Studio MLA, and working to first think about temporary ways to engage people and communities around the site, because of course this project could take up to 10 years to be realized. And the last project that I'll show is from Kibera. In the dozen public spaces that we've built there as part of our public space network, because they are along the riverine area, they're all in high exposure flood areas. Really, almost all of Kibera is in a high exposure flood area. So as we began to do these sites, with each site we built, the most costly and complex part of each project was this question of flooding and flood control. And this was also a priority issue consistently raised by residents because it affected all aspects of their lives. So at some point, maybe in our third or fourth site, we decided that we needed to zoom out and we needed to think about urban flooding from a much more holistic perspective. And this started what's now a 6-year initiative on urban flooding. It includes rigorous data collection, mapping work, and advocacy that's based on local knowledge of flooding to both improve residents and government responses to flooding and flood disasters. We've built several test sites that help us understand the effectiveness of 3 different community adaptive responses to flooding. And this work, turns out, has not only been valuable for us in Kibera, but it's also gone on to be used as the basis for a partnership with Nairobi's larger public work agency, and even been quite useful in work that we're doing in other places like Tecate, Mexico, and even the eastern Coachella Valley. So I want to close with just one more question. This is a question that we're often asked by students like you. Students often tell me after a lecture just like this that they would like to do the kind of work that KDI does, but they can't find any such jobs. They often ask if we're hiring or if we can recommend other firms like us. And while I'm always happy to help point them to our website or to other firms in their area, what I find more useful to say to them is that you can do this kind of work wherever you find yourself. And this is because I really believe that any firm, not just the nonprofit ones, can and actually should be asking with every project they take on, regardless of the scope or the client, how can we ensure that this project, in its own small way, contributes to a more just public realm? If it's a social infrastructure project, like a park or a plaza or a civic space, have we ensured that it will be equitably accessible and welcoming to everyone? If it's a streetscape or a transit network, has it made it easier for entirely new groups of people to access opportunity? Or have we just made it better for those who already have access? Or if it's an environmental remediation project, will the new, safe, and healthy space first and foremost benefit those that have had to endure the negative consequences of that environmental hazard for so long? Or will it serve those that are coming to the space only after it has been invested in? In this way, with these questions, we can all broaden our modes of practice, whatever kind of practice we have, beyond practices that create when invited by an RFP or by a call from a client, to practices that also catalyze when needed. Zip codes shape life expectancy, and designers shape zip codes. I encourage all of us to think of that with every line that we lay on the screen, every plan that we make in our studios, and with every plant that we plant on the planet. Thank you. Okay.
All right. Do I have to do something with this? No, it works. Okay. Thank you so so very much for your talk. This was fantastic. So just so that everybody knows, for the question and answer session, we will be handing around the microphone because for our online audience, we need to make sure that they're able to hear your questions, that they're recorded appropriately. So just to get us started off, I thought I would just ask, as mentioned earlier, the students in the Master of Landscape Architecture program had a great conversation with you yesterday. And one of the things that you mentioned was the importance about living where you're doing the work. And so you've got these amazing offices in different locations, and you spoke a lot tonight about how even though you're working all over the world, so many of the issues are very similar and can be seen in similar ways. I was wondering if you might just touch quickly on the things that are different, specifically probably things like how you get these projects, how they come to be in these different locations, and then maybe how you fund them.
Sure. And thanks for the question. Well, how they're different, I'll start with that, and then I'll say a bit more about how we get them. Certainly, what I don't want to insinuate is that the challenges are the same wherever you find yourself. But it is important to recognize that they are not as dissimilar as you might expect. The ways in which they're different typically are, of course, the physical context, and the political context, but also how you navigate the political context. So we can often find that the challenge in places as different as Los Angeles and Kibera is a stubborn government agency leader. But the way that you address that in Kibera versus the way you address that in Los Angeles are really completely different. And that's the kind of learning and knowledge that you can only have if you're rooted in a place and led by people who understand those different cultural, political, and social contexts. And so for us, even in the United States, the difference between navigating and creating change in Los Angeles versus the Eastern Coachella Valley or Wichita, Kansas, for that matter, is radically different. And if we don't understand that and try to kind of copy-paste a model from one place to another, we quickly find ourselves kind of stuck. So I would say that's to me the most important part, and where the community process is not just a luxury, but it's actually critical to getting work done, because it's through that community process that you really learn the do's and don'ts, and you learn how to navigate the change-making and decision-making process that is what inevitably allows the physical work to get done. And then to the question of how we decide or how we get the projects, there's lots of different ways. Sometimes it's as straightforward as it may be with a traditional firm, with an RFP or a call from a potential client. But what I think is unique about being a nonprofit firm, and why we are a nonprofit firm, is as a nonprofit, we're able to leverage different resources. And with those resources, we're able to self-identify or identify in partnership with community partners needs that need to be addressed that aren't currently being addressed or even recognized by the more traditional mechanisms of agencies issuing RFPs and things like that.
Great, thank you. I can't really see anybody's hands, but I'm sure someone with the microphone is able to, so perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was a very interesting talk and fabulous work. Of course, also the reference to the zip codes and the power of the designer to change the atmosphere and zip codes, or the importance, is of course very relevant. However, so you're doing all these beautiful spaces, and at one point you move on to next project. When we're looking down 10 years, 15 years from today, how can you guarantee that what you had put into place is still in use, is still a public space, and is still functioning?
Yeah, thank you for that great question, because it gives me a chance to talk about, I think, what is a critical component of our work, and maybe the first lesson we learned when we were students doing what we thought would be a 2-week project. In fact, what you've just brought up is one of the first things we heard from residents that gave of their time to help us get to know Kibera. The first thing they said to us is, you're not the first group of students that have been here before. And what we'll tell you is that almost none of them come back. And the ones that do, they come back and they build something nice, and then if they were to ever come back again, they would find that whatever they built is either no longer there or has been reappropriated for other use. As we began to dig into that, it was quite obvious. In a place like Kibera, residents didn't have the disposable income to maintain these sites on their own. And certainly if they weren't a part of designing what would be done, they may not have even had a use for it. So from day one, we knew that we had to work differently to avoid those circumstances, and that's really what led us to this idea of integration, one of the 3 core principles, that it wasn't going to be enough to just design and build something and make a physical change, that we also had to design the economic structure and the social structure alongside community members that would ensure its long-term success. And again, that's different in every place, but just to give you a couple of examples, in Kibera, those 12 sites that I described in the network are each managed. They were designed and are now managed and operated by the community partner that we first started out with. And some of those sites are 15 years old, and they're still there. And they're economically sustainable by small businesses or income-generating activities that we designed into the site from the beginning. So some have community gardens, some have community water kiosks, some have women's craft cooperatives. And so the site generates enough income to pay for its maintenance, and then that maintenance is overseen by the community group that we designed it with. In a place like the Eastern Coachella Valley, it's very different. The scale of the project, the governmental structure is different. And so in that case, what we did, we knew that we couldn't ask or expect that communities could maintain 5-acre parks, $1 million projects. And so in that case, we had to develop a different structure, which involved going to the local parks agency that had not been able to put parks in these communities and really sort of offer them a deal. And for the first park, what we said is, okay, we know you don't have a financial model for designing and building these parks, but if we figure it out, if we design it and we build it, will you take it into your portfolio after the fact and maintain it as a public space just like any of the parks that you have in the wealthier communities? And they said yes. And over time, they actually became much more involved partners, putting in their own resources and in subsequent parks, really leading the way. But that's how we've dealt with this question of ensuring that the spaces are public in perpetuity and that are cared for and invested in.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, really amazing work. I actually come from the US, so I'm asking from the experience there and working with the cities there. Are there conversations to ensure that local residents are not displaced because of the improvement of the area? And how are they implementing that?
Yeah, another great question. Well, at the foundation of our work is this idea that there should be development without displacement. And that is, especially in a place like Los Angeles, I will not pretend that that's an easy thing to accomplish. But what I will say is that is another place where the community design process is essential and not a luxury. Because, for example, I didn't show this project, but we have a project called Play Streets. It's very similar to the Adopt a Lot program, but it's about creating temporary public spaces by closing off your street for a day at a time. And we knew that to design that program in a way that wouldn't generate displacement or add to the gentrification already happening in this neighborhood, that we first needed to validate the idea, not just with the residents that we had developed it with, but over a much larger swath of the community. So getting that large-scale community validation that this is something worth doing was step one. Then step two was making sure that every choice along the way, where the play streets would happen, what activities would be included or not included, what the kit of parts would look like, were all made by residents, so that everything from the vernacular of the items to the messaging that's written on flyers or what's said at community workshops is done in a way that is about placekeeping for the existing community as opposed to attracting outsiders to a place that they may not have already been interested in. Again, I can't say it's worked perfectly, but or that it is perfect so far. We haven't seen projects where their sheer existence has been sort of a catalyst for gentrification or displacement. That's not to say that'll never be the case, but the community process is what helps us avoid that for the most part.
Thank you. In one of your early slides where you talked about how you go about your process, it was a four-step stage process, and you said something then that disturbed me throughout the rest of the presentation. You described it as how you approach your problems. It struck me you're not in the business of solving problems, you're in the opportunity development business. And it seems to be a core value in every one of your processes. As well, when you look at the unused lots, it's opportunity development.
Yeah.
When you build a bridge over the riverine, opportunity development to link the communities. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great point. I actually try not to talk about solutions, though it occasionally slips in there, because I agree with you very much. First of all, I don't think we've solved any of the problems that we are working on with any of our projects, even in places where we've been working for a decade or more. I think we're taking advantage of opportunities that are often identified not by us, but by community members, and we're able to add technical expertise, we're able to add strategies for accessing resources that help realize those opportunities that people are already seeing. So I think you make a great point, and it's a great note to use that word opportunity more than I do even problem alleviation, which is what I usually try to say instead of problem solving. Thanks.
Hi there. Thanks for your talk. I guess you had used this term a number of times during the course of your talk, and this is the idea of the community. I just wanted to find out how you managed to negotiate with various portions of each community so that the conflicts that are sort of attendant with each community and the complexities with each community are properly represented and sort of managed throughout the process, rather than having, for example, one spokesperson or two spokespeople who may be designated as community spokespeople, but who may not actually represent the community as a whole?
Yeah, great question. And the simple answer is it's very messy, and it's an imperfect process. What I'll say is, as a starting point, is we really, our community process, it really insists that we don't hear from one representative or even from a handful of representatives of a community. We feel like there's a lot of evidence, particularly in the United States, that that doesn't get you to the needs that are representative of an entire community or the many sub-communities that make up a community. So for us, just to put it in a practical example, if we're doing a community plan, a typical community engagement process in the US might be a series of public meetings. And we do public meetings because they're often required, but we first change the dynamic just of those to make them more of community fairs or community workshops that by their sheer design will attract more people than, let's say, a community meeting might. But then we always go far beyond that, and we talk about it as meeting people where they are. So we have another strategy. You saw a mobile trailer that I showed for one project that was our environmental justice hub. We often design these mobile engagement beacons, or they can be a cart, they could be a trailer, they could be lots of different scales, that we use to meet people where they are in a particular community. And that is a way that we can get to ensure that we can reach people that might not be able or interested in participating in a more formal process. It also helps us in a geographic place that's expansive or a large city to not just kind of go to the easy place, but to reach many different corners and bring people into a process quickly and conveniently. But even when you do that, you hear from more people, thousands of people instead of just a handful of people, that just adds more complexity. So there is a part of any process where we both have to bring our own expertise and kind of judgment and evaluation into a project process and either help make decisions or help shape a final decision. And what we do in that step to ensure that we haven't sort of derailed what a community process is leading us towards is something that we call validate and celebrate. So a community process for us ends by, this happens multiple times throughout a process, but certainly ends with us going back to a community in the form of a community fair or some sort of a celebration and taking the work that has come from this process back to residents to ask them, did we get it right? Is this what does this reflect what you've given to this process throughout the way? And of course, there's not one community, there's not one consensus in a community really ever, but we use that process to get as close as possible to meeting as many of the priority needs for as many people as we can. And of course, I just want to say, because in a presentation like this, it's quick and fast answers, and so sometimes I feel like it makes it sound like this is all so easy and it always works out perfectly. So I just want to give the very important disclaimer that it doesn't, and that this work is very hard, and many projects, every project has lots of setbacks and reroutes and doesn't always get everything right, despite our best intentions.
I have a comment.
Oh.
More than a question, I have a comment, and that is, first of all, thank you so much for your lecture, which I enjoyed so much. I just wonder, as I was listening to you, I've been thinking about someone whose work I admire a lot. Her name is Sarah Schindler, and she's actually a legal scholar. And I don't know if you are familiar with her work, but it struck me as I was listening that you would make a fantastic team. What she does is to pursue legal cases against infrastructure in the built environment that discriminates against people. So the most obvious example of this are the bridges, the bridges that prevented city buses from getting to Jones Beach in New York. And so what Schindler does is to sort of sketch out a case whereby you could actually make a class action suit against the city authorities who built this kind of infrastructure. So she's like the hammer. You're sort of like on opposite ends of a spectrum, and it just occurs to me that you two should probably be in touch directly and working together.
Noted. Thank you. I really appreciate that. There was a question up in the back there.
Yes, I know we're nearing time. We have time for one more question. I know we've got a hand up in the very back, but I don't know how, and does somebody have the, okay.
With the red jacket.
Thanks. Hi, thank you very much for the inspiring work and lecture. I just had a question about the context. You spoke about how context is very different in different places, and most of the projects you showed were in contexts that were to some extent informal or disadvantaged communities. So I'm just wondering, are there any lessons learned or principles that you learned from all that engagement that might inform projects or public spaces in more formalized contexts, in the centers of cities, to make those public spaces more inclusive to everyone?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, first I will say the work that we do in Los Angeles is very formalized, center of the city work. And what I think is really interesting, people often think that our work started in the US, and what we learned here is what we've taken to Kenya or taken even to the rural farm worker communities, but really it's the inverse. Our work started in Nairobi in an informal settlement that I've shared with you tonight. And then from there, we began to work in rural California in the Coachella Valley. And then from there, we began to work in the center city of Los Angeles. And what we do in Los Angeles is absolutely what we learned by working in informal settlements. And so, the lessons are really all of them. That I guess maybe the main lesson is that a participatory approach isn't just something reserved for the disadvantaged or for the underinvested in places, that participation is critical even in the most wealthy and well-resourced neighborhoods. You see this no clearer than on questions of gender and gender inclusion, because that issue cuts across income, class, et cetera. And so designing processes that just make sure that there are representative decision-making processes, I think is applicable no matter where you are. And the last thing I'll say is we're really beginning to understand that right now, as we have been working on the east side of the valley, the Coachella Valley, which is farm worker, more rural communities. But the west side of the valley is Palm Springs. And we're just beginning work on a parks master plan for the city of Palm Springs, which is, by statistics, a very wealthy community. And just weeks into the project, it becomes very clear how necessary a robust, inclusive engagement process is, because there are so many communities, despite the wealth, despite the resources, that actually have been marginalized and have not had the same access to public spaces and public infrastructure in this otherwise well-functioning city. So just to give that as an example.
Okay, I think we have to end there. But thank you so much for all of you for coming tonight. Thank you sincerely, Chelina, for your talk, for your call to action. I have a feeling none of us will look at public space through the same lens again. Just before we conclude, I'd like to remind everyone about the next event in our public program series. Next Thursday night, we have architect Kounkuey de Lawayo joining us to talk about Black Diasporas Project, a community-led mapping initiative that examines experiences, places, and spaces having meaning to Black people. And that will take place here in the main hall at 6:30, February the 15th. So now I'd like to invite everyone out to the Commons where we can enjoy some refreshments and continue our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.